Коллеги, добрый день.
Dear colleagues, we continue. Thank you for being here on time. Thus, we have an opportunity to start on time. As we have agreed, journalists would stay here for 10 minutes. After this, we would continue our work with our journalists. I would like to greet at our conference Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergey Lavrov. As you know, from the agenda, the topic of our session is priorities of the policies of Russia in the area of arms control and non-proliferation under the changes of the global architecture of security. But before I give the floor to Sergey Lavrov, in his presence, I would like to thank Foreign Ministry for partnership. We value this partnership, especially now when the dialogue is of extreme importance and the Foreign Ministry, despite recent developments that had to do with visa issues, agreed cordially to promptly issue visas to all participants of the conference, and the majority of them received visas free of charge, and I hope that this practice would be also used by other countries who also hold such conferences regardless of the citizenship of participants. Thank you. You have the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the participation to the conference that we believe is a very important event. It takes place in the times when such discussions are really welcome. We are hopeful that we will find truth in our disputes, but the disputes would be held in a professional manner without trying to achieve any geopolitical effect in the context of a lecture, but understanding the responsibility and graveness of risks in the area of strategic stability and arms control that we have in the world today. May next year would see the NPT review conference. We believe that the non-proliferation risks and threats that we face today has to be eliminated only on the basis of a rigorous fulfillment of this treaty and non-proliferation, with the balance that has to be struck between its three components, that is non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful use of nuclear energy. It is of crucial importance for the May conference to be non-confrontational to the maximum extent possible and to not repeat the conference of 2015, when, in fact, participants didn't want to talk to each other or even listen to each other, and each would express his own opinion regardless of what others said. Back then, we witnessed the prevalence of a perilous and at the same time delusional trend when nuclear powers were enforced to negate the existing nuclear stockpiles without taking into consideration their interests in the area of security or strategic reality. This approach led to a forced drawing up of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that remains open for signature. I would like to underline once again, Russia does not intend to accede to this treaty. We share the task of having a world free of nuclear weapons, but we don't need to achieve this goal through such unilateral and arrogant methods that underpin the treaty. We believe that the complete elimination of nuclear arms is possible only in the context of a comprehensive and complete disarmament with the equal and indivisible security for all, including for owners of nuclear weapons, as is foreseen by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is of crucial importance for the non-proliferation regime to achieve advances on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The fact that it has not yet entered into force 23 years after it's been opened for signature is a gravest problem. The responsibility rests with those 8 states out of the listed 44 who are supposed to ratify the treaty for it to enter into force. The stance of the US is particularly destructive because in its nuclear doctrine, it broadly states that it's not going to strive for the ratification of the treaty, and this threatens the future of this important document that is the only efficiently verifiable international agreement on comprehensive ban of nuclear tests to which there is no alternative. One more serious problem is the lack of clarity as to what are the odds of establishing a Middle East zone free of WMDs. It is directly connected with the fact that we need to have a successful NPT review conference in May next year. And in this context, we attach a great importance to a conference on the zone free of WMDs in the Middle East. We've been preparing it for many years. There was even opposition and misunderstanding from the UK and the US, but in the end of the day, we now have a format, a coordinated format for this conference that everybody would be happy about. And this would relieve certain tensions on the Middle East issues at the NPT platform. This is a very important issue. Let's not forget that the resolution that foresaw the establishment of this zone was adopted in 1995. Nothing has been done so far. We are going to actively partake at the conference. I underline once again that this is not a unique event. It is just the beginning of a process, so don't be afraid of anything, and we are going to base our decisions on a consensus. So we shall not artificially block this forum. It would be counterproductive. When many components of the non-proliferation architecture is being destroyed, the resolution 1540 of the UNSC is especially important as it tries to close off access of terrorists and other non-state actors to WMD-related materials. Next year would see the comprehensive review of the 1540 resolution. We hope that upon the outcomes of the conference, the 1540 committee would prolong its mandate, and we would work further on this important avenue. We welcome that the Board of Governors of the IAEA appointed the permanent representative of Argentina to international organizations in Vienna, Rafael Grossi. He has a very important task of promoting a uniting agenda for the member states, and this would preserve the spirit of consensus and friendly work. The IAEA has to remain a professional technical mechanism to verify safeguards and be central to international cooperation in the area of peaceful use of nuclear energy. We have no doubt that the safeguard system of the IAEA shall remain impartial, depoliticized, based on international law, and it shall entrench the joint achievements, such as joint comprehensive plan of actions on the settlement of Iran's nuclear program. Despite well-known and unacceptable acts of the US, JCPOA is still relevant, and it allowed to answer all of the questions that the IAEA had for Iran. It made Iran's nuclear program as transparent as possible and reaffirmed legitimate rights of the country to explore and develop nuclear energy under the control of the IAEA. Iran, the resolution of the UNSC, according to this resolution, is the most verified country in the world. It serves interests of all countries to maintain JCPOA and establish favorable conditions for its further sustainable, full-blooded fulfillment in a timely manner. We support respective efforts of the Europeans, but unfortunately, they do not yield any result so far. We believe that the settlement of the Korean peninsula's nuclear problem shall be done through diplomatic methods by all stakeholders and their dialogue. We believe that the full-blooded launch of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is possible only if there are political talks based on accommodations and compromises of the countries involved. Certain proposals on how to achieve this were proposed by Russia and China first in a roadmap and now in the plan of actions that we are about to finalize, and we coordinate this with the 6+ countries. Over the last years, the strategic stability exacerbated. It is going through a crisis, and it has to do with the destructive steps of the U.S. that, with a blind support of its allies, gradually destroy the architecture of international legal agreements in the area of arms control. This architecture, as you know, and you know better than others, has been built for decades, and it successfully served the common good in the most difficult times of history of the second half of the 20th century. But now this architecture for Washington is an unwanted barrier, a burden that restricts the U.S. opportunities to build up its military capabilities around the world, to exercise power politics, and, when need be, to directly use military force. And there are many examples of it. Destructive ramifications would appear because of the withdrawal of the U.S. from the INF Treaty. We have a lot of mutual claims, but instead of trying to relieve these claims in a constructive and business-like manner, our American colleagues decided to pull out of the INF. The specific and realistic measures proposed by Russia to settle mutual claims, I would say, have been arrogantly negated. It is said that most NATO members obeyed Washington and didn't take our invitation to see that the American claims have been fabricated. Because the U.S. already started working on the INF, land-based INF, we, as Vladimir Putin said, would have mirror measures. So instead of trying to save predictability, in order to save predictability, Russia decided not to deploy land-based INF anywhere unless the U.S. deploys same-grade American missiles. President Putin, in his personal message to leaders of the NATO countries and Asia-Pacific region, asked to join the prohibition for the deployment of the ground launch INF. The NATO didn't give any answer to this, and they even let us know that they are not going to join it and do the same. We know that the public discussions that had to do with the announcement of the U.S. to deploy such missiles in the Asia-Pacific, there were mentioned South Korea and Japan. So Seoul said that there have been no such discussions, but we know that there is always a reason for such talks. As for the START treaty, we see that this is the last efficient bilateral instrument in the area of arms and nuclear arms controls. We know that it is important to have this instrument because it would give us time to peruse approaches to how to control new military technologies and what to do with the expansion of a number of potential holders of such weapons. The signals that the U.S. sends do not inspire any optimism on the future of the treaty. I would say that the preliminary conditions that are permanently stated on the China's participation look quite dangerous. We would do our best to restore the control over these arms. We are open to constructive interaction with everyone who is ready for joint work to strengthen international security based on the consideration of interests, balance of interests of all the parties, based on a comprehensive consideration of all factors that affect global strategic stability. Among these factors is the unlimited deployment of the air defense system of the US. By the way, the configuration of this system doesn't cast any doubts on the fact that the missile stockpile of Iran is less in scale. So among these factors is the official plans to deploy assault weapons in the outer space, development of non-nuclear high-precision means of disarming preventive strikes, and the nuclear warheads of low yield with the doctrinal documents of the US that reduce the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. We shall not also forget about the attempts to weaken the defense capabilities of other countries through illegitimate unilateral economic pressure in circumvention of the UN Security Council. When they demand that they cease military cooperation with countries across the world and ask others to buy only the US weapons. We are also concerned by the attempts of our Western colleagues to make the work of multilateral organizations in charge of non-proliferation to make obey and serve their geopolitical interests. Thus, they try to appropriate the work of such organizations. A bright example of this is destructive steps of the OPCW. The technical secretariat of this organization has a mandate that is written in the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But last year, Western countries tried to substitute the international law by their own countries, and in circumvention of this convention, and with the votes of the minority, make the secretariat to work on the issues that are the mandate of the UNSC. As a result, we see that there are differences and opposition among the members of the organization, and this would affect negatively this most important convention. Our Western colleagues also try to prevent consolidation of international community in elaborating of single rules to counteract WMD terrorism and its components and elements. I mean here the situation in the Geneva Disarmament Conference, where several years ago Russia and China proposed to draw up at this universal, generally acknowledged platform, a new instrument, a convention on fighting acts of chemical and biological terrorism.
NATO members were categorically against that. But certainly some steps have to be taken in this sensitive situation when access to biological and toxic materials can be gained by those persons who are not supposed to lay their hands on such materials. So instead of trying to achieve something at a collective negotiating platform at the disarmament conference in Geneva, NATO members chose to work within some sort of international partnership, fighting against impunity in the use of chemical weapons, which is not based upon any international law. They have only invited to this partnership those who share the same approach Western countries adhere to, in particular in terms of accusing the Syrian government of chemical attacks that were investigated by the OPCW at the behest of West through such measures and steps that are in violation of the convention. So they are working at this exclusive club and are going to try to portray their achievements as an international achievement. So trying to substitute universal legal instruments acknowledged by everyone. They're trying to substitute the internationally acknowledged mechanism by platforms, exclusive get-togethers. They're only inviting their friends to. And this is a line increasingly pursued by our Western counterparts. I'd like to highlight that the threat of proliferation is too serious to be made an object of political, geopolitical games, to be made a bargaining chip to secure an advantage in international affairs, mostly in pursuit of geopolitical or political goals. We are convinced that we can only achieve success in non-proliferation if we build a dialogue which is open to everyone. Russia is ready to do that. We're interested in working with everyone who shares our goals of reinforcing international stability, peace, and security. And with a certain cautious optimism, we're encouraged by the fact that the day before yesterday, the first committee of the UN General Assembly endorsed the Russia-sponsored draft resolution on reinforcing the system of treaties to achieve non-proliferation and disarmament. 175 countries spoke in favor of this draft resolution, all NATO members included. Not a single country voted against. If this is a platform we can be united on, then we will be able to overcome both objective and mostly subjective differences and difficulties we are facing on the way to a secure and safe and peaceful world. And I'm confident that your conference, as well as the discussions you're about to engage in, will bring you closer to this important goal. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. Whichever suits you most, at the tribune or here from your chair. Colleagues, you've got 35 minutes to ask questions and listen to the answers Minister is going to give. But first, if you are not listening to your headphones, then please shut them down, because it creates some background noise and it's very difficult to work. The first question goes to Tariq Rauf and then Ambassador Haidar. Tariq Rauf, please.
Mr. Lavrov, I'm Tariq Rauf. I had the privilege of accompanying Director General al-Baradei at his meetings with you on the Iran nuclear file. Recently, French President Macron said that NATO was brain dead in defending against the Russian threat. And I was wondering what might be your response to this particular statement. And recently, when you were in New York at the CTBT meeting, you raised the issue of the problem that Russian diplomats and others are having in getting visas. And so I was wondering whether this important NPT review conference that you referred to, maybe we can move it to Vienna, where two of the three pillars, peaceful uses and safeguards, have always been present. With the CTBT, we also have an element of arms control and disarmament, and generally speaking, the Austrians do not create trouble in giving visas to diplomats. Thank you.
Я правильно понимаю, что это не журналист?
Do I understand you correctly that those who are next to the cameras are journalists? What you told that they were supposed to? Oh, we're online. Yes. Okay. Well, as far as the organization of international events is concerned, at different UN headquarters, yes, indeed, a very serious matter arose. The American side is not living up to its obligations in terms of ensuring the normal functioning of the UN bodies headquartered in New York at the UN headquarters. And this is not just about an inadmissible attitude towards Russian diplomats. No, delegates from a number of other countries are facing the same problem. There was a very serious discussion within the first committee, in particular, that deals with disarmament issues. There was a discussion at the Committee on the Relations with the Host Nation, and the report emerged after this discussion states clearly that the American side is acting illegally. And the agreement between the UN and the government of the United States as a host nation to the central bodies of the United Nations stipulates that in such situations there needs to be an arbitration procedure which is supposed to be initiated by the UN Secretary General. So far, we are patiently waiting, but we cannot wait ad infinitum. And this matter is not just about this or that conference, be that the NPT review conference or any other session. No, it's a matter of systemic nature, and it has to be addressed as such. And we shall insist that all the methods, all the procedures stipulated by the agreement on the headquarters with the host nation should be employed to the full by the UN Secretary General. Now, as far as the medical issue is concerned, I'm unwilling to participate in this discussion on a diagnosis. If President Macron feels that this is the diagnosis that is evident, then he has the right to do so. He knows NATO far better than I do because he represents a country which is one of the leaders of this alliance. Of course, we would like to have a normal dialogue with NATO. We're not to blame for almost all forms of cooperation being frozen. It was not at our initiative that the military-level dialogue was suspended, and we were not the ones who stood at the origin of measures undertaken by the alliance in Brussels with regard to Russian diplomats. They are suspending their answers, taking several days to give an answer. Of course, well, we're not going to wait for that and ask patiently. We want to have a normal dialogue. Once NATO gets better, we'll have good relations, I hope. Ambassador Haider, ex-ambassador to Pakistan.
Our strategic dialogue in 2003 with Russia. I have two very small quick points, and one is that Russia has very good relations with the countries in South Asia, which again, South Asia has become a nuclear flashpoint. And I believe that you could strengthen your voice calling for a dialogue between the two countries, which you have been doing, but perhaps more forcibly, because that is the only way out to have a better situation there. And secondly, while in this conference and in your address, arms control is a very major point, I suggest that it's not just the countries and multilaterally for arms control, but in South Asia, if you have the major powers pouring in arms and technology, BMD, nuclear submarines, and one of them treating one of the countries as a net security provider, you get such an imbalance that strategic stability itself is endangered. So therefore, a certain amount of self-restraint also on the part of the major suppliers would also be a good idea. Thank you.
Спасибо, господин посол. Прежде чем нам дать Сергею Викторовичу ответить, упомяну, что папа...
Thank you very much. Before I give you the chance to answer, Minister, I'd like to remind you that the father of Ambassador Haider was Pakistan's ambassador to the Soviet Union. Well, in this particular case, I can only express my agreement with the direction your thoughts have taken. Indeed, the issues in the proliferation of weapons and WMDs, but not just that, other forms of weapons, modern high-precision weapons, well, all these matters require a separate discussion, and this is something I mentioned in my opening remarks. But not a single proposal of ours is getting a clear-cut response from our major partner in this dimension, the US, I refer. And this makes it difficult to do anything on our own. But we are constantly reminding everyone of multiple proposals in strategic stability and arms control that we handed over to the US and other leading world countries are aware of and that still are on the table. Now, as far as India and Pakistan are concerned, back during the Soviet days, our country did a lot to ensure a constructive relationship between these two countries in a non-confrontational manner, and should the two parties be willing, we will certainly be ready to contemplate forms in which the parties might find it useful to see our participation in this process. But to cite an achievement we already see, I'd like to point out that with our active support, both Pakistan and India joined the SCO, which creates yet another platform where leaders and foreign ministers can talk to one another on a regular basis. The SCO platform creates a very constructive, very corporate-like, as it were, friendly ambience, this SCO spirit, which I am hopeful will help promote dialogue between Delhi and Islamabad for the sake of the peoples of this region and the countries. Thank you, member of the Academy, Mr. Rogov. The floor is yours. Minister Lavrov, you aptly said that Russia's proposal as to the non-deployment of intermediate-range missiles as the only way to prevent yet another spiral of an arms race, which I'm afraid can bring about a repetition of the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62 or something even worse. But as you said, the American counterparts are not responding to Russia's proposal, and they are putting forth two counter-arguments. First, the very term we use, moratorium, which we sometimes use, is interpreted as Russia's attempt to save the missiles that are already in violation with the treaty. And there is a parallel to '62 when the Soviet Union also proposed a moratorium while preserving its missiles. So the first question is whether we should continue to use this moratorium, which is used against us to throw an umbrage at us. And the second question, how can one verify the implementation of Russia's initiative of non-deployment? A question arises whether this verification can use the inspection mechanisms that are used, for instance, under the Open Skies Treaty. Well, for instance, some flights can be used to make sure that there is no deployment. And even the New START Treaty, which stipulates on-site inspections for mobile ICBMs, which Russia has, is yet another instrument which can be used to make sure that the obligations of non-deployment are being performed both by us and by the Americans. Now, as for the term moratorium, well, you can call it whatever you like if you do it. I don't think it's an issue of terminology. Everyone understands everything full well. Whatever you call it, a moratorium or reciprocal obligation, commitment to non-deployment, they are saying that we're trying to trick them because we've already deployed these missiles. But we respond to them, or rather, we remind them that for quite some years, we've been trying to persuade the Americans to present to us concrete evidence corroborating that we are in violation, and they're categorically against that. The only thing they could show is satellite images that would corroborate their allegations, but so far no one has produced any satellite images. It's like with MH17 shut down over Ukraine. Those satellite images were never shown to anyone either. Well, in this particular case, they're saying you are in violation of the treaty, destroy your missiles. We were proposing whole procedures to alleviate and dispel their concerns, but they are still insisting on what they insist. Back then, we invited them and all NATO members to a demonstration. All NATO members were simply forbidden to come and to attend the briefing that took almost 2 hours and that answered any questions. Well, of course, in the absence of the US, the questions that were asked never covered the whole sphere of interest that our European and Western partners could have. But they did have a chance to come to this demonstration. But I think they simply acted impolitely. The only one who broke this prohibition were Bulgarians, Turkish, and Cypriot. Oh, no, Greeks, I think. Cyprus is not a NATO member. Well, it speaks for itself how people behave, and it can tell you what they really think, what they really want. Whereas our grievances with Americans in terms of target missiles that fall under the category of these missiles, the UAVs that were not covered by the INF treaty, well, all that. We proposed an additional set of negotiations on UAVs, but they refused. Mk-41 missile is something we've been pointing out for many years. We've been saying it can be used for the launch of offensive cruise missiles, even though the Lockheed website that produces it says on an open website this missile is dual use. And the Americans have never explained why so far they have refused to acknowledge that Mk-41 can be used for launching cruise missiles. The last thing about verification mechanisms, President Putin has sent an address to more than 50 nations and their leaders, I think. It's a 5-page document, and which says in detail that we're willing to talk about this moratorium or whatever you like to call it. And it says that we want to consider verification measures. The ball is in their field. Next is Francesca Giovanni.
Thank you. Very insightful
Could you speak up, please?
talk. My name is Sitara Noor, and I'm a senior research fellow at Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, Islamabad, Pakistan. My question to you is that the global non-proliferation regime in general is in disarray, primarily because of some of the unilateral revisionist actions by the United States, and also because of the lack of leadership from the states who really matter in this regard. Do you think Russia has the ability, will, and capability and ability to take that leadership role that is lacking at the non-proliferation regime at the broader level, and particularly with regards to Iranian nuclear issue? You have talked about India-Pakistan crises briefly, and how to save the REVCON in 2020. What role Russia can actually play to display that leadership that is required at the higher level? Thank you.
Я уже упоминал, что необходимо сделать для того, чтобы конференция 2020 года не...
I've already mentioned the conference of NPT 2020. I already said that I don't want this to repeat the sad conference of 2015. But to avail ourselves of all of the opportunities, it's not enough for one country to take leadership. As for the review procedures, a special role here has always been played by the permanent 5 members of the UNSC that, according to an agreement, legitimately have nuclear weapons. given the sentiments to move as fast as possible to the nuclear weapons-free world, and given the desire of many anti-nuclear activists to put aside other factors that affect strategic stabilities, it is impossible, because we are talking not only about the destruction of nuclear weapons just for the sake of destruction thereof. We don't want the world to have destabilizing arms that would pose constant threats and risks. So I'm enumerating factors which we need to take into consideration on our way to reduction of nuclear capabilities. As for the Great Five, everybody looks at these 5 permanent UNSC states, and those who lobby the nuclear-free world accuse the 5 of being slow, of acting in a manner that is not responsible enough. So here we need constructive steps, and they are proposed by the 5 powers, nuclear powers, and they are really relevant now for the year's review conferences to be held in a constructive manner, for the 5 countries to show that they do not ignore the sentiments of many other member states of the NPT, but for that the 5 countries shall unite. The issue of 1995 that we cannot solve, we cannot convene the conference on the Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and WMD free zone. So when, according to one of the 5 countries, we see that the JCPOA is almost destroyed, although it has been hailed by everyone as a great breakthrough, not only regarding the Iran's nuclear program, but in an area of the non-proliferation regime's reinforcement. And this doesn't give much credit to the Great Five in the context of this conference. Russia believes that we need to have this conference, believes that we need to have the JCPOA. As for the US, we don't want to describe them as the country that is not able to agree on anything. We know that this is a collective responsibility that rests with the 5 countries. And we want this responsibility to take over the political issues and these timely things. We want the experts of the 5 countries who have the understanding to try to elaborate recommendations that would allow the leaders of the 5 nuclear powers to act responsibly and to promote generally acknowledgeable agenda in the area of non-proliferation. We still have time for 2 questions. And if we have any time after 12, then we would ask more. Francesco Giovannini, Preparatory Committee of CTBT, and then
I work directly with Dr. Zerbo in his cabinet, and I really want to thank you in particular for the great cooperation and the support you are lending to CTBTO and also to Dr. Zerbo personally. So I know he really appreciates your friendship. I am the strategist in his office, and so I'm here actually to see if you can help me do my job better. I have 2 small questions. The first one is, I think it's evident to everyone that Russia now is the player in the Middle East. We have a Middle East weapons conference coming up. So I'm wondering whether Russia would put on the table the possibility of, for example, a nuclear test-free zone as a first step in the Middle East to get started with the discussion. And the second question to you is, Since 2016, I know you have worked with Dr. Zerbo on the possibility of a moratorium on nuclear testing, a declaration among all the P5. I'm wondering if there are conditions in your view today to get back to the idea and really release finally a declaration by all the P5 on at least this moratorium. Thank you.
As for the second question, I've already mentioned that in my greetings that the U.S. has officially stated that they have no intention to ratify the CTBT. So what would they think of the proposal to declare moratorium? Because we have it officially. It's not set in stone in legal terms. It is a good idea, but maybe you better discuss it with the Americans and other colleagues if you help us. Well, perhaps, sometimes when Russia proposes something, everybody would be suspicious of some hidden agenda. But if you do this as a neutral party, it would be easier for you. As for the Middle East and the proposal to launch the agreement on the nuclear test ban treating this region, well, I think that this would make more difficult the discussion on the WMD-free zone. So we sat outright with the prohibition of nuclear tests. That means that we do have already something to test, but we don't want any weapons there to be tested later.
Yeah, I'm a chancellor at Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Not many issues raised regarding the North Korean denuclearization. After breakdown at Hanoi, there is a big, difference between the U.S. and North Korea. And U.S. one of the main point is U.S. pressure North Korea to lay out roadmap and the end state of denuclearization. On the other hand, North Korea is asking the U.S. show the end state of, guarantee of regime security. And I think you have been working on mediating role and laid out action plan. And how you evaluate your action plan, to me, in my perspective, is not really well taken by both sides. So how you evaluate your action plan as a mediating role, or if you have any secret to persuade both sides, because it's just really critical situations. Thank you very much.
As I've already mentioned, when we started our efforts to establish a dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington, together with the Chinese, we expressed our stance. We support such contacts. And we frankly expressed our assessment. We think that we can achieve success only based on reciprocal steps, step after step, gradually, consistently. And we warned against a rationale according to which North Korea shall first get rid of its production facilities and all the related manufacturing, including missiles. And after this, only we can think about providing for the economic development and lifting off sanctions. But this rationale cannot function at all, and the meeting in Hanoi proved this. Our roadmap that we've elaborated together with the Chinese People's Republic, we think that we need first reinforce confidence through meetings. Next step would be to take some tangible steps, including seizure of exercises, suspending launches of missiles, and the next step would be to start talks. This is how it's been done, well, at least until the recent maneuvers that you had together with the U.S. These led a respective negative response of the North Korean leadership. Now, when the rationale of the roadmap that is acceptable by others as well. Now, after this, we've drawn up a plan of action that is based on reciprocal steps. It describes steps that, without any detriment to the reputation of the U.S., can be taken by it, and same steps could have been taken by the leadership of the North Korea. The plan of action has been published a couple of weeks, even a month ago. It's been considered by the capitals of the 6+ talks. As far as I understand, it's taken in a positive manner. So we've formulated ideas, but we cannot implement these ideas instead of the US or North Korea. So we need an impetus to be given to the contacts that have been weakened now. But we have a regular dialogue with the US, with Mr. Bigin, who is in charge of that issue. We have a permanent dialogue with Pyongyang. Today's conference, as I understand, brought together experts from the US and North Korea, and we consult always our South Korean colleagues. And I would conclude that saying that we don't need to expect that Russia or China would do things instead of the US or North Korea. And we shall not just wait until the dialogue is restored. The additional track, the additional vector of contact between the south and north of the Korean Peninsula has been put aside, which is not just, and we have not heard about this process for long ago. We have achieved some tangible agreements on the pilot restoration of the railroad connections. We were ready to consider some trilateral projects with the participation of both Korea and Russia. And an additional component of this task of stabilization and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula would be the importance of relations between two Koreas. Last question.
I'd like to engage you on your comments on the OPCW, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And I think the problem is that we've seen recent use of chemical agents, and despite a lot of evidence on attribution, this evidence is contested, and the analysis is contested. So surely, given the importance of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and its an importance of compliance and upholding the convention, it's a good idea to empower the OPCW to carry out independent technical attribution so that any events in the future, we might be able to have a more agreed analysis in the international system. And the compliance issue still rests, of course, with each country, not necessarily at the UN Security Council, but within each country. And just one last question, as I think it might be the last. Would you ever imagine that we will get to a nuclear weapon-free world?
Ну, это уже, наверное...
Well, this is something theoretical. If you ask me, I would stand up for a nuclear weapons-free world, but a human being is unpredictable, and people always want to be superior. It's our pride that underpins our nature. So now, so far, we want to achieve a world free of risks and threats. And for the visible future, if we have safeguards and guarantees from threats with the remaining nuclear weapons, with all the verification mechanisms, control mechanisms, and the rest that we need for the world free of suspicions, then let it be. But that is making us get back to the topic. If the world would be safer, with the air defense systems, with the weapons in the outer space, with the prompt global strike weapons, and many others. With all the imbalance of conventional weapons that's been forgotten, by the way, I suggest you read CIPRI report on the heavy armaments in Europe that the NATO has, and I mean only Europe, and the ratio of them in Russia. NATO has by 2 or 3 times more than Russia, and we need to take this into consideration in our discussions. As for OPCW, I agree that any cases of the use of prohibited chemical substances shall be investigated independently. And these independence, the independent nature of its work, hasn't been provided for. The Technical Secretariat was established according to the convention with the only purpose of responding to reports on a possible use of prohibited substances, and the mandate was to define whether the substance was applied or not. Nothing beyond this. An important detail here, whether the substance was used or not, is the obligation of the Technical Secretariat, but it can done so only according to the procedure agreed upon by the convention. So an independent expert shall go to the place of the incident for them to have samples of air, of soil, biomaterial, if there were any affected people. And then these samples shall be delivered to a certified laboratory, and in the presence of experts of the OPCW, only if their custody is provided for. And after this, OPCW can draw up its own conclusions. But before the crisis in the organization, these rules have not been abided by, starting with Mr. Shehun, with the Shehun case, when experts said that they don't want to go to the place of incident because it was not safe there. When we insisted that experts go there, the Hague told us that, well, by a lucky chance, the samples ended up in Paris and London, and the French and the Brits shared these samples with the OPCW. How do you like this kind of independence? Of course, we asked London and Paris. We said that OPCW cannot send its experts because their safety cannot be provided for. But if you have these samples, so you know people who you can agree with on your safety, so can you provide for the safety of the OPCW experts? Can you send them there? But they said, no, we don't want to do this. And when we asked them, how did you get these samples and where did you get them from? They said, well, it's a secret. Is that independence of the OPCW? Are you independent from Paris and London, or are you not? And after this awful case, there's been published a report on this incident, and it was clear from it that it was fabricated and orchestrated, and the report consisted of these so-called highly likely, we have good evidence to suggest, most probably, and phrasings like this.
This was an absolutely unprofessional document, which is a source of shame for international officials. So this joint investigative team, which was sanctioned by the UN Security Council, as should be the case when investigative measures have to be carried out and blame has to be attributed. Well, this mechanism was not carefully thought through, and it discredited itself. And of course, this did not speak in favor of our Western counterparts, because 99% of those teams were representatives of Western countries, whereas the fact-finding mission, which had been previously established for Syria, had been headed by two people. The first was the head of the group that looked into investigating the complaints of the opposition against the government, and the other, the group investigating complaints of the government against the opposition, and both were British by some strange coincidence. So this mechanism and its fate was sealed in advance, and it was used unceremoniously. So we didn't allow to prolong the mandate of this mechanism. So with other like-minded countries, we proposed right then that a new mechanism should be established with a clear-cut mandate, saying that only the procedures under the convention can be used during the investigation. But our Western counterparts didn't like it, because they wanted to use those illegitimate, illegal procedures that I've been speaking about. So this is about the rules that the West wants to introduce. They want a rules-based order, and it's very different from the international law. And international law is about conventions, about agreements we have, and the convention says that you've got to go to the site, then you have to take samples, deliver them to the certified laboratory. The laboratory has to make its own conclusions, and this is the procedure that is stipulated. But they want to stick to a different one. Samples got through some shady channels. It's a whole different story. It's these rules they want to substitute international law with. And the OPCW case is very illustrative. That's what our Western counterparts like to speak about, a rules-based order. But I think it's not the rules devised by an exclusive club of countries, but universally agreed international instruments, including conventions and decisions of the UN Security Council, have to underline our activities. Thank you, Minister. Unfortunately, the hour we agreed upon has come to an end. I do hope that in future we're going to have a chance during other sessions to talk indeed about other issues that have been raised, in particular the Korean Peninsula, the JCPOA, the Russian-American dialogue on arms control. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your support, Minister. I do hope that during the next conference we'll be as efficient, as constructive in our work with the Russian MFA. Thank you.